My name is Kathy Noneman, and I'm a member of the Nevada Women's History Project. Today is Friday, August 18th, 2017, and this interview is being done with the support of the Robert Z Hawkins Foundation grant. And we have the pleasure today of interviewing Patty Dillon Cafferata, who was the first woman elected to a constitutional office in the state of Nevada. And she served as our first woman state treasurer. She has also served 3 of our counties as district attorney. Patty, I'd like you to tell us, to begin this interview, about your formative years, where you grew up, a little bit about your family, that sort of thing.
Okay. Kathy, I was born in Albany, New York, and my mother, Barbara Vukanovich, ultimately came to Nevada for a divorce. And so I came here just before my 10th birthday back in 1950. And so I grew up here. I went to St. Thomas Aquinas grade school, and then, of course, graduated from Bishop Manogue High School. My family, of course, my mother wasn't Barbara Vukanovich in those days because my stepfather, Ken Dillon, had died, and she had married George Vukanovich sometime later. But Ken Dillon was a lawyer here, very prominent tax and corporation lawyer. I have a brother, Mike, who passed away a few years ago. I have a brother, Ken, who's named after his father, and a brother, Tom, and a sister, Susie. So that's the beginning of, growing up in Reno.
And what position do you hold now, and how did you get there?
Wow, that's a long story. I am Special Assistant Attorney General for law enforcement, counties, and municipalities, which means I deal with all the law enforcement agencies in the state, whether it's the Highway Patrol or wildlife, game wardens, local sheriffs, chiefs of police, the city councils and county commissions, and all the elected officials. So it's a government kind of relations kind of job, but it is also, I do a lot of training for law enforcement and for prosecutors.
And you have been involved in different aspects of the law for many years. Where did you go to law school?
I went to Southwestern School of Law in Los Angeles, and I did the 2-year program. It was called Scale. It was pretty brutal because we went year-round. We took 2 weeks off at Christmas and 2 weeks in June, started the day after 4th of July, and went to the end of June. So it was not an easy course, but from there I went on to be district attorney and over the years, Lincoln County, Lander County, and Esmeralda counties, which are some of our small rural counties, although Lander County on Battle Mountain on Interstate 80 has a lot of traffic, drug and otherwise, on Interstate 80. So I met my husband, Treat Cafferata, who was a Reno native. He grew up to be a surgeon, and when I met him, I was in high school. And of course, this is something I wouldn't recommend anybody do today, but I met him when I was dragging Main Street, which was Virginia Street, on a Saturday night, which is like probably very dangerous today. But Reno was a very small place in the 1950s. And so, and his family and my family knew each other, but we had not met. And he was at Stanford already, and I was still in high school. So we did get married after my 3rd year in college, and have 3 children, Elisa, Farrell, and Reynolds. Elisa and Farrell were born in Portland, Oregon when he was doing his medical school training, because we were married when he was in medical school. And then Reynolds was born in San Francisco because he was doing his surgical training at Cal in those days. So and we were married 53 years before he passed away.
Where did you go to college, Patty?
I went to Mills College for 3 years, and I picked that, and I only applied to women's colleges because I was tired of competing with the guys in high school, and they always got the better grades or all the honors. And so I was tired of competing with them. So I picked a women's college, Mills College in Oakland, and did the 3 years. And then when Treat and I got married, I transferred to Lewis and Clark College in Portland, because that's where he was in medical school. And I wound up with a degree in elementary education. I'm not even sure they even have that anymore, but in those days you could major in becoming a teacher. And so I was always liked kids, always liked teaching. So that's what I got my undergraduate degree in.
Did you ever teach?
Yes, I did, actually, for a year. Treat's last year in medical school, I actually taught school in Portland. And then when we moved to San Francisco and he was doing his training, surgical training, I applied to the school district and they didn't have any openings. And, you know, teachers, they're either too many or they're not enough. And so they put me on a waiting list, and like 3 years later, they said, oh, we've assigned you to the school. Well, I'd moved on. I was teaching speed reading by then, so I did not go back to that.
And when did you go to law school?
Oh, well, long after that, I had run for the legislature. I had been elected to the assembly, and I represented Southwest Reno. And, you know, in the legislature, those lawyers, and there weren't a lot of them in those days, but you know, no matter how much homework you did, how much research you did, they would get up and say, well, as a matter of public policy, you know, we ought to, and it's like, and they'd win. I was like, that was a little frustrating. So when I ran for governor against Dick Bryan in 1986, and he won handily, I had a chance to change directions. And what do politicians do when they lose elections? They go back to practicing law, right? But I wasn't a lawyer. And so one of my daughters said, well, you know, Mom, if you want to go to law school, you know, because she had dropped out of law school and I was not happy about that. She said, why don't you go to law school? And so I said to my husband, well, can I go to law school? And he said, as long as my life doesn't change, you can go to law school. Of course, we didn't have a law school in those days. So I went out and bought him 30 pairs of socks, 30 shirts, 30 shorts. And I went off to law school, and I came home once a month to do the laundry, and I cut his hair, and I did the grocery shopping, and you know, fortunately he did the dishes in between. But anyway, so that, and you know, looking back, women didn't become lawyers when I was growing up. You know, you either became a nurse, a secretary, or a teacher, and I became the teacher. So you know, it wasn't something that women did. And when I was in law school almost 30 years ago, it wasn't, maybe 25, 30% of the students were lawyers, or women. So.
And what influence did your mother's career have on your career?
Well, as you know, my mother, Barbara Buchanovich, ultimately was our representative in Congress, and she was the first woman elected to Congress from Nevada. And I just happened to have a picture of her with me in the book that we wrote together. I interviewed her for actually 5 years. Once a week I went in and sat down with her for an hour and wrote down what she said, and then I'd take it back to her and she would edit it. And you know, the first time I went back, I said, well, what do you think? She said, well, it's awful. I was like, great, this is not a good beginning. So anyway, we went through, and you know, my brother, I think, did my brother Mike die? George Buchanovich died during the time. So there were times that we did not interview. But, you know, there are things that, you know, it's all her words. And we made sure that it wasn't my words, it was her words. And there was one, I had written something, some guy was wearing brown pants or something, and she said, well, it's not pants, they're trousers. It's like, trousers? I mean, this is not a word I would use. But anyway, we did all that. But I was elected to the assembly before she was elected to Congress. So, you know, people say, oh, you're following in your mother's footsteps. And of course, I jokingly say, oh, she's following in mine, which of course wasn't true. But anyway.
How old were you when you were elected to the assembly?
38, somewhere around there. You know, there were not a lot of women in the legislature. There were 5 of us in the assembly. 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats.
Right.
And we, we voted our values and conscience and all that. But there was one funny time that all the women voted together. And it wasn't planned, it wasn't strategized. You know, when you're down there, you have a button, either green or red for yes or no. And this bill came up about the price of butter because they wanted to raise it. And all the women hit the red button. And everybody in the place just cracked up because it was like, we never voted together particularly. And this was not planned. And it was like, whoa, it was sort of interesting. So anyway, but there were only 5 of us then.
And do you remember who they were?
Jane Ham, Helen Foley, Karen Hayes, myself, and Peggy Westall from Sparks. So.
And how many terms did you serve in the Assembly?
Just the one. And I had run for state treasurer originally in '78, and I didn't know no woman had ever not been elected to constitutional office, right? I just thought I could do it, right? It was a job I was interested in, so I filed. And it wasn't until after I had lost that race that I found out that, I wasn't alone, right? And I think I got like 44% of the vote, which was the most any woman had ever gotten in a statewide race. It wasn't enough to win, but so then I ran for the Assembly, and then the next term it was like, do I run for the Assembly re-election or do I run for state treasurer? And one of my advisors, Ed Allison, I was saying, what do you think? And he said, Patty, a full-time job is always better than a part-time one. I was like, yes, that makes sense, so go for state treasurer. So I did, and then I was elected then.
Yeah. What motivates you to keep going?
And she didn't say nicely, at my age, right? I like being involved. I think it's important to society for everybody to be involved and try and make a difference. And I don't have any agenda. I didn't have an agenda when I went to the Assembly. State treasurers, that's an administrative position, right? Keep the books, make sure they're balanced, invest the money. So that's not a policy job. But I've never really, and I know there are men and women who have a burning passion for something, and that's why they run. And I won't say I was just interested in the power, but a lot of guys are just interested in the power, and I don't see anything wrong with the women being interested in the power.
And you had mentors as you were growing up, and it occurred to me that your stepfather, Dylan, was an attorney.
Yes.
And did that have any influence on you?
Absolutely, in terms of having a career. And he was very disappointed that I wanted to be a school teacher. I mean, that was a career. And it was but that was the era. And his mother and grandmother were college graduates. I mean, it wasn't like he was oppressing women. It was just, you really want to have a career? And, but he was a very fine lawyer and very well respected and very well known in the legal community here. So certainly that was an easy path to follow.
And do you remember any other mentors or individuals that had a major influence on your life?
My mother and grandmother. And my grandmother, her mother, was very involved as a volunteer, Red Cross, some of the other community things that she was involved in. And my mother was always involved, whether it was St. Mary's Hospital or Community Chest. I mean, these are all old names, but, she was always involved, and that was very important to her. And all of the kids were expected to contribute.
So it was a family tradition.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And you've been a lifelong Republican.
Right.
And I think, of course, your mother was.
No, she was actually a Democrat.
Was she?
Yes. Yes.
So I was wondering was it a family tradition to be a Republican? Was everyone a Republican?
she grew up in an Irish Catholic family, and her father was a general, ultimately was a general in the Army, and they were, of course, Democrats, and that's what she grew up with. And when she came to Nevada and married Ken Dillon, he was a Midwestern Republican, right? And so they got involved in the Republican Party when they were first married and continued all of that. He was the chairman of the Nevada Republican Party at one point. So they were always involved in the party. So, and that's what I grew up with. That's what I learned.
You wrote a book with your mother about her life, but you've also written several other books.
Yeah.
So could you tell me a little bit about those?
Okay, well, I just happened to have a book or two here. This is, my latest book was Christmas in Nevada, which I did with the University Press. Actually, Mother's book was with the University Press, too. And this came about, the University Press, the editor, contacted me and said, would you like to write a book on the history of Christmas in Nevada? And I was like, that took me 2 seconds to say, yes, I would love to do that. So, because other states have this kind of book, Christmas in Minnesota or Illinois, and so I wrote a story on every county, because it's Nevada, so you got to have all 17 counties, and started about in 1858 or so and went to 2010. And then I interviewed different Nevadans, either just, everyday Nevadans, and then some elected officials or retired elected officials, Dick Bryan, Bob List, both former governors, one Republican, one Democrat, some other elected officials. And then, African Americans, there's a Native American story. There are a couple of Danish stories, which I didn't know that there are a lot of Danes in Nevada, but there were quite a few, depending on which communities you're in. Douglas County, for one. And so I had different ethnic groups and how they celebrated and their traditions. And then I've written some small books that I've self-published. And one I did bring, which is Tales of the Biggest Little City in the World. And these are a collection of my newspaper columns that I wrote on Nevada, and I did 3 in this series, and others like on the Goldfield Hotel, which is a haunted hotel in Goldfield, Nevada, because I was the district attorney in Goldfield, and the Mapes Hotel, which I jokingly always say I was the lawyer trying to protect them from blowing it up, and you know what happened, they blew it up, so I didn't do a very good job on that one. but anyway, I've done at total there have been 9 books.
9 books, yes. And you've done a lot of public speaking as well.
Yes.
with those books.
Yes, I have gone out and spoken to a lot of different groups, women in politics. I wrote and did some research on the death penalty in Nevada. That's not a book, but it's an article in the Nevada Lawyer, which is the official Nevada bar magazine. And for some reason, people ask us.
You've been on that editorial staff for a long
I
time.
have been on that for more than 10 years. Yes. So.
And also, were there any other authors or particular books that stand out that influenced your thinking?
Well, influencing my thinking, probably Atlas Shrugged, which is a Ayn Rand book that I read on my honeymoon, if you can believe that. I'm a very active reader, and that was, I don't know when it came out, but it was one of the more popular books in those days, and probably influenced me a lot. And of course, I read a lot of history. I read a lot of Nevada history because I need to know more than just what I'm writing about. You have to have a broad brush. So, there aren't any particular Nevada authors that I would say, but I've read all the classic Nevada history books.
And what experiences would you say were particularly transformative in your life that you said, this was the fork in the road?
Well, certainly getting married. That really changes your life, or it should. Having children. Education, certainly. Getting that first degree to be able to be a school teacher. You know, you can't do that unless you have the degree, right? And then being a lawyer, graduating from law school. When I think of my job now, there are a lot of experiences that I've done. You know, as the ED of the Ethics Commission for a while. So you get a whole look at that. And of course, that's managing a state agency. It's not a big one, but it's managing a state agency. So, you know, you look about budgeting and personnel and then, of course, doing the job, you know, investigating complaints and that sort of thing. And the other thing that comes a lot into play, and I am not sure exactly why, but let me back up 1 second. I clerked for Dave Gamble, a district court judge in Gardnerville when I first got out of law school. And you know, you learn so much law because a district court judge deals with everything from criminal matters to civil matters to contracts to gaming law. So that's a wonderful introduction to the law. And then I did, years later, clerked for Connie Steinhammer, who was a former law partner of mine. When she needed a law clerk for a very short time, I went down, and that was fun. But I never really aspired to wanting to be a judge, but then I became a personnel hearing officer for state personnel, where you're judging whether the discipline is proper and appropriate and was done according to law. And that was my judging experience. But all of that I use in my job today. Not that I'm doing judging or anything, but it's just those experiences. You know, you get better judgment or wider understanding of things.
And how would you like to be remembered, other than your family?
That's it.
That's it.
That's it. I want to be remembered as a good mother and grandmother. You know?
Well, you've been that plus, so I'm sure there are other things that you would like to be remembered for.
Well, my writing, and I hope my contribution to Nevada history certainly is. You know, I feel like when I do the research and I write it down, it's all new, because even though it's out there, it hasn't been written down before. And I think that's a contribution to Nevada.
And what would you tell young women of today? What would if you could give them a message, what would that message be?
Do what you like, work hard, be reasonable, be fair, be considerate. You know, the dialogue today is, I think, horrific. We just don't even try to understand each other. And, you know, just because we disagree on something doesn't mean we're mortal enemies. And it seems like that's where we are. And I think that's unfortunate. I think that you need to get along, and you can disagree, but you don't have to hate each other.
And so you've seen a change in your years in government, in civility?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, when I was in the legislature, you couldn't tell the Republicans from the Democrats because of how they, you know, you'd look at a floor vote and, you know, there were conservative Democrats, there were liberal Republicans, you know, most people were in the middle, but you know, there was none of the animosity or name calling or any of that when I was there. And you know, people used to say that to Mother, and Mother would say, it wasn't like that when I was in Washington. I think that's really unfortunate that we can't sit down and compromise. Compromise is not a four-letter word. And we'd be a lot better off if we all did a lot more of that.
And one of your stepfathers was George Vukanovich.
Yes.
And what influence did he have on your life?
George was a wonderful, wonderful guy. Everybody loved George. And he and Mother got married after Treat and I had been married, so we already had 2 kids by the time they were married. So he actually raised my younger brothers and sister because Susie was 2 when my stepfather died, and Ken was about 12 and Tommy was about 10. So George was the father that they knew. You know, he supported Mother. Didn't matter. I could not tell you what one political idea that George Vukanovic ever had. You never would have known. He was there for Mother. He supported her 100%. He flew her around the state. He drove her around the state. Went back to Washington with her. You know, and he came from Round Mountain, Nevada. You know, he was a true Nevada guy. And, you know, he was a good father and a good grandfather. All my kids just adored him, as all of my siblings.
The thing I remember about him was he said, "I want to be introduced as Mr. Barbara Vukanovic, Assemblywoman."
He had a badge that said George Vukanovic, the husband. And he did, you know, he loved going back and doing things with Mother, going to the White House. I mean, you know, he enjoyed all of that, you know, and supported her 100%.
Were there any other people that you can remember that particularly represented to you the Nevada statesperson?
Oh, of course, Paul Axel. And of course, I work for his grandson. So, yeah, it's when I met Adam at a dinner, going through shaking hands with people, and he said, "I'm Adam Laxall." I said, "Man, we're practically related, right?" He sort of looked at me like. So when I told him who I was, you know, so I was very fond of Paul. I thought he did a great job, and a true Nevadan, and he was, of course, a native, and as is Adam. So he would certainly be one, and of course I had the most contact with him as far as, you know, our senators and congressmen and governors. So he would be one I would definitely say, and of course Ronald Reagan. Of course he wasn't a Nevadan, but
Right.
Certainly admired
and
him.
Did you ever in any way work with Ronald Reagan?
I did. I ran his campaign in Washoe County when he ran for president in 1980. So,
And if you had to look back at the 20-year-old Patty Dillon Cafferata, what would you like to tell her?
wow, she didn't expect any of this. You know, I was going to have 6 or 7 kids and, you know, do what my mother had done, all the volunteer work and all of that. And of course, since I grew up in a politically active family, you know, I would have expected to work on campaigns and did, you know, everybody from Paul on down. But that Patty would be very surprised, very surprised.
You brought some pictures.
Oh, yeah.
Would you like to show us?
Well, I brought a couple of my family, my 3 children, and my husband, and this was taken as a campaign photo back in 1986. We were down at my son's house in Southern California. So that was, you know, you got to have the family brochure. So that was one. And then the other one that I brought is the same time, but these are the 3 of my grandchildren that were born by then. Of course, I have 9, so there were another 6 that came along after that, but that was the same time. And then again, that was a campaign photo. And then when you're talking about changes in life, here's my law school graduation picture, which really did change my life and direction of where I was going, because I could do all the things that I've now done that I couldn't have done when I wasn't a lawyer. And then I brought this one because this is kind of fun. This is when I was the DA in Esmeralda County in the courthouse. So it was just an informal picture that my assistant took. So those were just sort of the different slices of life.
Thinking about how the female legislators united around the issue of the price of butter.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about why the price of butter was important?
Well, in those days, and I don't know if it's true today or not, but butter was regulated. The price of butter was regulated, and it was a dairy commission proposal or something. But of course, the women were the ones who go to the grocery store and went shopping in those days, so they knew the price of butter. They didn't want it going up, you know. And the guys, I'm sure, didn't even occur to them because they probably didn't do the grocery shopping. Today, you know, men do grocery shop, but back in the 70s, you know, that was kind of the women's job.
And the women, you said there were 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats?
Other way.
Other way.
Yeah.
3 Democrats
And two
Republicans.
right.
Did you unite around other issues, or what were the women's issues of the day?
They really, that was not an issue. We did not, except for the butter, that was not something, you know, we were all very cordial. You know, we got along. And so it wasn't like we banded together or anything like it. You know, the Republicans were together and the Democrats were together, but, you know, we all had a very cordial relationship. And I can't even think of any women's issues at this point. I just, nothing stands out.
Nothing that was separate from
no,
the regular
right,
agenda.
Right. So.
And what about the women in the legislature? How did the men treat you?
Oh, you know, no problems as far as I can remember. We were treated equally. You know, both parties caucus with their own caucuses, and that's probably where you get the most of it. But we were never mistreated, looked down upon. You know, that was fine. I do think of one of the funniest stories, though, and this was not when I was in the legislature, but Senator Jacobson, wonderful old guy, she can say that now. Anyway, he introduced a bill, and this was back, I think, in the early 70s, that women couldn't wear pants to the legislature, right? And so, of course, the next day, all the women showed up in their pants, right? But Virgil Ghetto, who was another rural legislator from Fallon, we were at a Lincoln Day dinner once, and he said, I don't know what happened to Jake when he introduced that bill about women in pants. He says, I've never seen Jake's wife in anything but pants. So it was like, I don't know what the guy was thinking, but anyway. But none of those things came up when I was there.
And you went to small rural counties
Yes.
to serve as district attorney. Why did you do that?
Well, a lot of reasons. One, it's very hard to get a job in the Washoe County DA's office or the Clark counties. Not that I was applying there, but, you know, this is where I live. So, so if you wanted to be a DA, you had to drive a little distance, right? And so I was appointed twice and I was elected once. I was appointed in Lincoln County, and that is as far away from Reno as you can get. Pioche, the county seat, is like 450 miles from Reno. And I flew to Las Vegas and drove north for 3 hours to get to the county seat every week. Stayed about 3 days. It was a part-time job. And I had been the deputy district attorney in Eureka. And I went out and applied because they had a job and they needed a criminal prosecutor, and I wanted to be a prosecutor. So I'd applied and I'd gotten that job. And then some differences with the DA over a child molesting case that I was prosecuting, and he wanted to let the guy out. I was like, this is not for me. So I said, gee, I think I better retire because you're the boss and I can't do this. And the next day, the DA in Lincoln County, which is not exactly close to Eureka, called me and said, how about meeting me in Ely and we'll talk about my job. I need somebody to fill in while I take some time off. I haven't had a day off in 3 years. And so we met, and I went over. I said, it was just this short little appointment. And he came back from his vacation. He said, I'm retiring. You can have the job. And I was like, okay. So that wasn't really on the list. But anyway, and it was a long commute, and the county paid for I wouldn't have done it otherwise, but they paid for my airfare down, and they gave me a car. I said I have to have a car. So the first car they gave, or the second car they gave me a patrol car that had like 200,000 miles on it, and it eventually died. And then they gave me this truck, this pickup truck that they used to transport the bodies back to the morgue in Las Vegas. And the sheriff kept saying to me, when am I getting my truck back? And I was going, can't have it back because they got to give me a car. So I drove. And my son said, you better get better negotiating skills, Mom. That's really, you know. So anyway, they paid for all the travel. And then a couple years later, I'd gone out to Battle Mountain to represent a client, was in court, came out, I'm in the parking lot, somebody comes up and says, why don't you run for DA here, because we don't like the guy we got. And I was like, well, ooh, it's like 230 miles from Reno, and it's on Interstate 80. That was an easy commute. So I was like, oh. So I talked to a bunch of people, and I threw my hat in the ring, and I got elected and served. And then my mother decided to run. She decided to retire. What did she do? She retired. And so she wanted me to run for her seat. So I resigned to run for Congress. And of course, I didn't get elected. And then a few years later, the district attorney in Esmeralda County got recalled. And so they were looking for a DA, and so I went down and applied, and there were 4 or 5 of us, and they picked me because they knew me, right? I'd been running for office, and so, and I've enjoyed all of the jobs. And then back in 2010, I retired there in 2003. In 2010, I get this call, their DA had resigned in September. His term ended in December, so they needed a DA for 3 months. And it's like, where do you get a DA for 3 months? And you have to have one. You have to have a lawyer, because you have to have somebody who's doing all this. So they said, would you? So I said to Treat, well, you want to go to Goldfield for 3 months? So he goes, okay. So we went down for 3 months, and one of my daughters had a motorhome, so we drove that down there, and he stayed in that while I went to work every day. And that was kind of the same crooks. Honestly, they were the same people I'd prosecuted 7 years before. The same civil problems. They just never go away. Civil stuff just accumulates a lot. So anyway, that's because I wanted to be a prosecutor.
And you were, I think, the first woman to hold that position was it in Esmeralda County or Lander?
You know what? I wasn't the first in any of those counties, which is very interesting, but I was the only woman who's been a district attorney in 3 counties. And there were 2 other men who have done that. One was back in the 1890s or 80s, and then I don't know how long he'd been here, but Andy Demetris he was a Reno lawyer, and he was the district. And the one thing about all the 3 of us, we were all district attorney of Esmeralda County at one point. And Andy was there. He was in Tonopah, and then, like in the 70s, he was out in White Pine County. He ran. It was like, but the Demetris family probably came from White Pine County. But anyway, so I'm the only woman of the 2 other men.
That have served as
3, and I keep jokingly saying I'm looking for another county, but I don't think so.
Patty, you've talked about your colleagues that served with you in the assembly, and that male and female, Democrats, Republicans, you all were able to work together,
Correct.
Even though you had different opinions and ideas. Yeah. Why do you think that was possible in those days?
I think there was less partisanship. When I think about my legislative session, which I didn't mention, we united with the Democrats to elect the Speaker. So the Republicans, the 12 Republicans, and 12 or whatever Democrats, because the Democrat Party was divided, we had this coalition. And so there was a lot more camaraderie, at least between the two parties. The Democrats were not so nice to one another because, they disenfranchised a whole bunch of them. But, it was, the partisanship wasn't as strong in the legislature in terms of, as I said, they were conservative Democrats, there were liberal Republicans. And, when we caucused, we would talk about things, but, we went out and all voted our own conscience, what we wanted, what we thought. Nobody told us we had to, march lockstep. And I think that's what's happened in Congress. I think it's what's happened in the Assembly. When they have caucuses, they are told how to vote. And, and part of it is, in not only the Nevada legislature, but in the House of Representatives, the parties raise the money, right? And they help you get elected, and then you owe them, right? You can't just say no. And if you say no, you know what they'll do to you? They'll run somebody against you in the primary and take you out. So that wasn't strong in those days. And that's a...
If you voted your conscience and you voted not in the way that a party wanted you to,
Right.
They didn't brand you as disloyal to the party.
No, and I had the voting record of voting no the most was 10% of the time, which is like, that sounds terrible. Oh, she voted no, the worst, right? And the closest person to me was 5%, and he was our leader. He was the minority leader. So, there was no backlash for that. I mean, but the party didn't help me get elected either. So, but there was none of that there is today. And it's in both parties. It's not, it's not just one party or the other. And it's in Congress too, as you can see.
And do you think it's a matter of money?
Well, it's a matter of pressure, because if they help you get elected, right, then you're going to owe. And, if you're independently wealthy, which I'm not suggesting that people do that to get elected, but, you have some independence, but there doesn't seem to be any independence at any level. And I don't know whether other states are like us, but certainly it mirrors what's going on in Washington.
The differences then were not so much between the parties or between the individuals, but how about between the North and the South in Nevada?
Well, we're a north-south state, and when I was in the legislature, that was a session that we did reapportionment. And so it was a battle because, and that was a huge battle, and it was a battle north and south. It was not necessarily partisan because, the South was getting more seats, the North was losing, and we did the reapportionment for the first time for the second congressman, which my mother became. And so the issue became, well, you can divide the state two ways. You can divide it east to west, or you can divide it north to south. And if you divide it north to south, you come down the western border and you divide every city, every town, all the way down. And so the population in the two is going to be in Las Vegas, and they will have 2 congressional seats. So that, and this is funny, I'm sitting in my office one day, and my mother calls and says, how's reapportionment going? It's like, my mother's 61 years old. How come you care about reapportionment, right? And she goes, well, I'm thinking of running for Congress. It's like, whoa, okay, well, here's where we are. And what happened was, because there were only 12 of us in the 40-seat legislature, we couldn't have affected it. But, when you have the Northerners, Democrats, to help, and Bob List, who was governor, I don't know what he promised to Democrats, but 2 of the Southern Democrats voted to divide it this way. And so you know, when Mother first represented it, she had the northern tier of Clark County, because it's all driven by population, right? So they have to be equal. So she had all 17 counties. 10% of the district was in Clark. Today, Mark Amadei has the 10 northern counties. And in between, you know, we have 2 more congressmen. So, but that was a battle, and that remains a battle. The North and the South. You're getting more money. You're not. It's unfair. You know, we're driving all of this. There's a lack of understanding of the rural counties, that now they hardly have any representation, because they have no, the population-wise, you know, Clark County is now 1.5 or more million people, so they're going to get their lion's share of the representatives. In fact, I think more than 20 of the legislators come from Clark County now, so the rurals have very little representation, and it's very difficult. Because they're struggling, and you know, Clark County's we got these people, we need the roads. Well, you can't get to Clark County except on some other road from somewhere, right, in the rural. So it's that's a big issue. That is a bigger issue than partisanship, although partisanship today is pretty rigid.
And your mother, when she decided to run for Congress, she already had experience with that congressional representation. Didn't she work for the previous congressman?
No, that was Jim Santini. And he was a Democrat at the time. He later became a Republican. No, she had worked for Paul Axel. She'd run his campaigns in northern Nevada. She and Hazel Gardella had run those campaigns. And then when he was elected to the Senate, she ran his northern Nevada district. But she traveled the state for all the Republicans that, you know, were running for federal office. So she was very knowledgeable about mining, grazing, you know, all the rural people and their issues.
And they were familiar with her.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So
thank you very much, Patty.
It's been fun. I've enjoyed it.
Really interesting.
Yeah, thank you.